Hello my friends, and welcome back once again to the YouTube review series that has not uploaded this consistently since Obama was still in the White House. Today is a very special day for many people around the globe, many individuals, and that is, of course, because it is Consequences Day. In addition to being Easter in the Western tradition, at least in this particular year, 2022, I can already hear you asking, what is consequences? Well, consequences is something I've repeatedly alluded to over the last several videos I've made, and I think I've occasionally made reference to it in other videos. Consequences is, well, first and foremost, it's an album. The debut album by the British art pop group Godley Creme, who later became the 80s music video makers Godley Creme, and who are credited on this release by their full names, Kevin Godley and Lowell Creme. They were previously members of the group Hot Legs, and also integral members, and indeed, in some respects, lead songwriters of the 1970s English art pop band 10cc, who I have covered at some length prior to this, although not such extreme length that I did not skip an album, but we'll get to that eventually. Anyway, Consequences is the result of the band breaking down during the sessions for what was to be the follow-up album, and what eventually materialized into the now only two-person group of Graham Goldman and Eric Stewart's next 10cc album, Deceptive Bends. There are several accounts of what went wrong during these sessions, and if I went into great detail about the making of Consequences, I could easily make an extremely long video in and of itself. But the important thing to know about, perhaps more than anything else, is that Kevin Godley and Lowell Creme were no longer happy with the material that was being put out by Goldman and Stewart. Specifically, I've heard that the song People in Love, which eventually made it onto Deceptive Bends, was the catalyst for a lot of this acrimony, as Creme and Godley felt that it was not a very good song, which, again, like I said in the last episode, strikes me, of course, from the outside looking in, as an example of, something I touched on then, a lot of the people I talk about on this channel, I would say perhaps creatively pretty high-strung. One of the best examples of this, as far as the bands I've talked about, would probably be King Crimson. I'll touch on this maybe later in the year. Fripp, but also Bill Bruford and some of the other people who were in the band strike me as being extremely high-strung people creatively. And, if the vibe's not right, they're out. To make what could be a very long story short, that seems to have been what happened in 10cc. According to some accounts, there was a brief period where Stewart was out of the band and they were a trio, and then, Godley and Creme broke off to do Consequences, which originally started its life as a 45 demo record for their invention, the Gizmotron, which I outlined in my previous episode on 10cc's final album with Godley and Creme, How Dare You. But over the course of the production process for this album, which was extremely intense and honestly more than a little bit ridiculous at times, you got stuff like burying a door with a microphone under it to simulate the sound of dirt being shoveled onto a coffin in the grave. Consequences eventually ballooned into a triple disc rock, progressive, 20th century classical, British new satire, jazz, unstaged stage comedy, radio drama without the radio thing. And it is one of the most singular things I've ever heard in my life. I've used the word singular a lot when I've talked about 10cc, perhaps unfairly at times, but this is absolutely a qualifying album. I would put this in the top 10 weirdest things I've ever heard in my life. Not because of what it is per se, if you separated the component parts of Consequences, I think they would be fairly normal, because there's functionally three. There's the stuff on disc 1, which is, sort of ambient, progressive, 70s Post-rock wasn't a thing yet when this album was made, but I think to some extent you could qualify some of the stuff on disc 1 as post-rock, even though, strictly speaking, post-rock is a thing, and it's 90s, and it's indie, and it's British or Canadian. It depends whether you're talking Lost Generation or Crescendo Core type stuff, but I'm getting wildly off track here. And then the second part of Consequences is the sort of... It's Peter Cook, who of course was a comedy legend. As an American, I'm not that familiar with Peter Cook, but the stuff I've seen of his and heard of his makes me think that he could be a very funny man. And it's a sort of play about two people getting divorced, two ridiculous lawyers, and the amateur electrician, architect, and unsuccessful musician living in an attic underneath them. Through his 20th century classical composition, which is the third part of the record, saves the world, or does he, from rampaging nature and weather which have overstepped their boundaries and are seeking to annihilate the human race. Any one of those things would be fairly standard. If disc 1 existed in and of itself, it would just be a Tubular Bells type ambient progressive rock whatever album from the 70s. The Peter Cook stuff existed in isolation, it would be some pretty good Peter Cook stuff. If the 20th century classical piece that closes the album existed in isolation, it would be a pretty decent but kind of okay 20th century classical piece with Gizmotron and piano. All of those things combined makes for an incredibly strange listening experience, which I am very excited to talk about today. So the album opens up with a fantastic instrumental Gizmotron soundscape that I think is supposed to represent the ocean and the people upon it in the days and hours leading up to the great calamity that is the main body of Disc 1 of Consequences, and the inexplicable revolt of the natural world against the human. It's a really compelling piece. I think it captures, the grandeur and the menace of the sea really well. Sort of the vastness and insignificance of the human being compared to the ocean. And I really like the guitar bit towards the end of the track. It reminds me a little bit of sort of late Waters era Floyd. Think like the instrumental stuff on Wish You Were Here or Animals, which is not the last time I will be making that comparison on this album. And so with Wind, the story really begins in earnest as nature, attacks humanity through the wind, the sea, destroying ships, drowning people. Most notably in the middle of this track, the wind destroying the house of some poor guy in the Midwest. And it's all communicated through wonderful gizmo passages, some very evocative melodic things. The percussion is really quite good. It's all pretty much instrumental music except for the brief little comedic but also very, very dark interlude in the middle and some sung bits at the end. Fireworks is an extremely brief passage that mostly exists to provide context for the next track on the album, in which an errant firework, which I believe is a direct quote from the liner notes, triggers a forest fire that in turn leads to a stampede of animals in a former British colony in Africa. Which brings us to Stampede, another, phenomenal gizmo stuff. Really this whole album could just be phenomenal gizmo stuff. It's all pretty much one thing, but there's a couple of really cool interludes in the middle. Like a guy humming the melody of the song who is then implied to be stung to death by bees, or a sort of disco-era DJ at a radio station who I think is implied to be trampled by elephants. It's all very dark, and really that's the whole first disc of this album. It's very dark, but also kind of exuberant and silly at the same time. little bit of a course correction for me, 10 minutes from the last recording. It's not actually all one thing. It transitions, there's some cool spoken word, processed effects bits, transitioning into some really eerie, almost Varese stuff ending the track, or beginning the next track, something that I thought I was going to bring up in an intermission, but now I don't know if I'm even going to do those anymore, is that the digital version of this album I've used for this video, not necessarily the one I listen to the most, is the 2019 Caroline Records reissue, which is in some ways a fine re-release of this album. Certainly it's the easiest one to get your hands on these days, aside from just buying the original vinyl. But in some respects, it is less than ideal. A big thing that I know a lot of Consequences heads are not happy about is that it's a compressed recording. It's very much in the tradition of bringing these old 70s albums that particularly in the 70s, and to a much lesser extent the 80s, and sometimes the 60s, not really usually a lot, but I've talked about how subpar a lot of 60s production often was before, so it's not really relevant. Anyway, these albums were often very dynamic, and Consequences in its original form, if you listen to the vinyl record, is an extremely dynamic recording. This is not, which is less of a problem in the circumstances that I'm going to listen to Consequences digitally, like in my car or when I'm going for a walk. But, if you're really trying to have the audiophile experience, it's less ideal in that sense. And you probably want either, I think there's a 90s German reissue that's generally highly sought out in that regard, or you want the original vinyl, which I happen to have. But the other thing about this that is somewhat more problematic in terms of this video, and is why I even brought this up, is that there's a certain amount of fuzziness about the track listings, and in some cases this reissue just completely messes with them. In the case of this song and the next song, I'm not actually 100% where one begins and the other ends, because the band is kind of indistinct on the record, and Discogs says one thing and the CD says another. All of that is probably incredibly boring to you, but maybe you can get something from it as sort of a little bit of an inside baseball as to how I put these together, and also a recommendation to, like, if you want to get this version, but just, be aware it has its limitations. And until next time I do this, I have been the Rustic CD re-release reviewer. So we move on to the closing track of side 1 with Burial Scene, a really gripping track. Begins with something I mentioned in the intro, where Godley Creme put a microphone underneath a piece of wood. I said it was a door, but it was a piece of wood, and then shoveled sand on it from the top of some stairs in order to simulate the sound of dirt being shoveled onto a grave. There's also this really cool effect where you hear the clergyman administering the funeral service over what I think in the liner notes is perhaps implied to be a mass grave of victims of the weather. And what he's saying grows more and more indistinct with every bit of dirt that's shoveled onto the coffin, and it's this really grim but really well done and atmospheric effect. Okay, so for real this time, this is just one thing all the way through for 6.5 minutes. It's cool, it's interesting, it's evocative, it's atmospheric. It's all the words I've been using to sort of obscure the fact that, like many critics, in fact, I think like most critics who aren't like of the very highest level and or specializing in that kind of music, instrumental stuff like this is kind of an Achilles heel of mine, because, on a certain level, it's hard to actually get words to describe it adequately. But this, nonetheless, like I said, is very good. There's an interpretation of this track that I've heard from several other people and that I tend to agree with, that this is meant to represent one of the 5 main characters of Consequences. Mr. Walter Stapleton, the amateur hang gliding factory worker and giver of puns that are just sort of wrong, asleep while the world burns around him. And so finally we have the first real song of the album. It's once again a very, very good song. In this case, a sort of odd character song about a hurricane that destroys Hawaii. Musically, it's very interesting stuff. It draws heavily from like South Pacific, the musical, and also from Exotica more generally. There's a kind of congruence with something like 70s Haruomi Hosono stuff and the Yellow Magic Orchestra in certain respects, of sort of grabbing a hold of that type of stuff and pulling it into the track. Not that self-aware. I mean, it's engaging with that stuff, but it's not trying to play with it like a Hosono project would. I also should note, once again, this is a case where, for whatever reason, this release of the album chooses to cut off the entire second half of this track and assign it to the opening minute or so of The Flood, which, Discogs tells me supposedly some vinyl releases of this album did, but the one that I have doesn't. So I'm going to assume that was how it was originally and treat it accordingly. But anyway, like I said, very, very good track. There's some really neat call and response stuff between male and female vocals, and it's just a really, really strong track. Maybe in some ways the most memorable thing so far, aside from perhaps the opening of Wind, but it's all up to personal taste. So we end disc 1 of Consequences with Flood, a track that opens up with some watery noises and a recurring dripping bit before building up into probably the most obviously contemporary sounding track on this album. Very much sort of ambient prog in the vein of contemporary Brian Eno or Pink Floyd. It's meant to symbolize a performance at a rock festival in upstate New York, which is then subsequently drowned by a flood. And this part of the album ends on another pretty chilling moment of high-frequency noise and a heartbeat and water sounds slowly fading out, with the obvious implication that this is somebody being drowned. Disc 1 of Consequences is extremely strong, and is the part of the album that by far works the best in isolation, which is why I've structured this video so that just in case I don't actually get the rest of the video finished tomorrow, I can throw what I have together and make a standalone video and then just do the rest of the album next week. Very much in the formula of the other sort of grandiose, wild 70s rock opera triple albums that immediately spring to mind, Joe's Garage by Frank Zappa and Preservation's Act 1 and Act 2 by the Kinks. But as of right now, it doesn't actually look like that's going to be the case. So I'm going to keep this intro short, but if you see this video uploaded by itself, know that I have failed. One of the most fascinating things about this album to me is that it is like the most 70s thing to ever exist. Not just because of what it is and its component parts, but in the sense that, this is like record label guys throwing so much money at this thing because, it was two proven hit makers, and Tubular Bells had been a huge monster hit just 4 years previously. They actually mention it in the liner notes, They have this ridiculous, deluxe, triple disc box set packaging, with this extensive set of liner notes with all kinds of art and a description of the story of the album inside them. It's just really cool stuff. The Chemical Brothers used that for an album cover a couple years back. There's even a little bit of an essay about the making of the album in there. It's just really cool stuff. Really cool stuff. They really went all out for this album. Unfortunately, including the price point, it was not cheap. If I remember correctly, this was something to the order of $50 or $60, and whatever the equivalent value in pounds was at time of initial release. And it also was released at an inopportune time. This album was released in 1977. Culture is, of course, very complicated, and there are so many moving parts, but the important thing to know is that this record came out right as punk was cresting its first wave. And critics and listeners were starting to turn on stuff considerably less ambitious than this album. Never mind something as off the wall as Consequences, and the album bombed. Deceptive Bends, released the same year, sold very well, had a couple of successful tracks, and 10cc went on to have another big hit on their next album, and so Godley Creme wound up with Egg on Their Face, which will be a huge part of the next Godley Creme album I talk about, whenever I do that. But anyway, let's move on to Disc 2. Discs 2 and 3 of Consequences are very different than Disc 1. In fact, in some respects, they almost feel like a different album, even though instrumentally and conceptually, they are very much of a part. And that largely has to do with the fact that the bulk of Discs 2 and 3 of Consequences is taken up by a audio-only narrative play written primarily by Peter Cook, who is somebody I don't necessarily have the time to discuss as much as I perhaps should. Peter Cook was one of the luminaries, one of the leading men of something in the UK that is referred to as the satire boom of this particular period in the 50s and 60s when, a certain type of satire really caught on and was, very popular over there. And for the most part, from what little I know about Peter Cook, what's on this album is pretty in line with what he did. Now, right off the bat, I'm just going to warn you here, the audio play is an integral part of Consequences. It is the main reason the album is as unique and at times completely unhinged as it is, but it is also very, very difficult to talk about. So while I will allude to the overall plot of the audio play and sort of describe bits and pieces of it to you, I'm also mostly going to concentrate on the music because this is a music review channel and not a English radio plays from the 1970s review channel. So track 1 of Disc 2 is 5 o'clock in the morning, and it's a beautiful song. One of easily the best of the actual sort of pop songs on this album. In a lot of ways, probably the best. It's, I would say, easy top 5 solo Godley Creme stuff. And it's a track that, unlike a lot of what's on here, I could very easily imagine this more or less fitting onto a 10cc album. Lyrically, it has to do with one of the primary characters of the play, the amateur hang-gliding working-class factory worker Walter Stapleton, getting up and getting ready to go to his meeting with his lawyer to get a divorce. It's really, really good stuff. There's some great piano. There's a wonderful vocal. I believe this is a Lowell Creme vocal. My thumbnail artist commented to me when I made him listen to this album that it reminded him a little bit of Billy Joel, which I did not hear at all at the time, but going back to it, I actually kind of hear it. Anyway, it's a very, very good song. So let's move on. There follows in between an introduction of the rest of the major characters of the cast. Mr. Haig, Stapleton's alcoholic lawyer. Lulu, Stapleton's wife, whom he is divorcing, and who is French, I believe played by Peter Cook's wife at the time. And very, 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 very strongly implied to be a prostitute. In fact, towards the end of the album, I would say it's basically all but stated. Who married Stapleton in order to get into the UK. And finally, the character who leads us into the next song, Malcolm Pepperman, Lulu's lawyer, a very loud and very angry Jewish man. I have, of course, left out a character, Mr. Blint, the most important character in the entire piece in many respects, an amateur electrician, architect, and unsuccessful musician who lives underneath Mr. Haig's office, in fact, underneath a hole, which exists in a piece of farcical and wonderful satire, or whatever the alternate meaning of those words you choose to interpret, because he was the only person in the entire block who refused to sell when the building was constructed, and thus it was erected on top of him. A lovely little musical interlude while he's being introduced that I very much enjoy. And after a bit of general comedy that sometimes lands and sometimes doesn't land, and sometimes I think that You know, maybe if I was about 35 years older than I am and I had grown up in the UK, I would think this was the funniest thing ever committed to tape. Peppermint goes to an extended rant about the fact that he is in fact Jewish, and it segues into the next song, which I'm fairly certain is supposed to be sung from the perspective of Peppermint. When Things Go Wrong is another phenomenal track on the album, a real example of studio trickery, featuring Mel Collins, formerly of King Crimson, and then later of Foreigner. In fact, I think perhaps during the making of this album he was in Foreigner, but that's besides the point. Saxophones all over the place, really witty, biting lyrics. You know, the bit about never waking up in the morning because you never get to sleep at night, you know, I relate to that a lot. And very notably, there's a bit in the middle where they did a ridiculous amount of work to make a guitar sound like a saxophone, and frankly, I don't even know that it sounds all that much like a saxophone, but it sounds really cool, so I'll allow it. After that, there follows a bit about Mr. Stapleton falling asleep, him not knowing how many combs his wife owns, or half combs, a lot of other stuff that I, frankly, you know, I'm not gonna summarize to you because, you know, it's better if you just listen to the album. And then eventually you get into a short bit about hang gliding and also the failure of the relationship between Stapleton and Lulu. And it brings us properly once again into the next track. Lost Weekend is a phenomenal piano-driven sort of almost old-school pop song that features jazz legend Sarah Vaughan on a guest appearance in the choruses. It's incredible stuff, frankly. Maybe not the album's best song, in my opinion, but an all-timer. And, you know, I've, at points throughout this project, kind of bemoaned the fact that, you know, some of this stuff, I think, could have perhaps been better contextualized in 10cc, you know, and that I almost wish they would have stayed, and that I do wish they would have stayed together, but at the same time, there is some stuff that came out of this album, and there's some stuff that came out of later Godley Creme that could probably never have been shoved into the mold of 10cc, and this is absolutely one of those tracks. It's incredible, wonderful stuff. Kevin Godley acquits himself really well on this track too. Something I like about this album that maybe I'll go into greater depth in the outro, maybe I won't, probably not, is that Kevin Godley is used here, is used really well, he's used sparingly, and he's used with Cream, because what winds up happening in later Godley Creme albums, particularly in the 80s, is that Kevin Godley just becomes the front man, and you never hear Lol Creme again after a certain point. And Kevin Godley's got one of those voices where it's a good voice, it's a great voice, it's a really wonderful sort of golden voice, but at the same time, it, you know, an album full of nothing but it can sometimes, for me at least, be a little bit like, you know, a little bit too much of a good thing, you know? Rosie is really interesting, if nothing else. It's a little vignette of Blint's early life, bookended by Peter Cook sort of talk singing in the Blint voice, and then you got Kevin Godley in the middle just singing, really just giving it his all, and it's a really effective little piece. I think it conveys individual human tragedy really well. The story essentially is Blint was married during the Second World War. He was in the service, and while he was at the bar having a drink with the boys, a V1 flying bomb narrowly missed the bar and leveled the entire street that he lived in while his wife was at home. It's very grim and it's very sad, which is true for a lot of consequences, but what I think stands out to me is that it's sad pretty much the whole way through, where a lot of consequences, you know, there's horrific stuff, and they go darker than I think a lot of people writing to a concept like this would, but at the same time, there's this goofiness to it, you know, there's this, like on side one, I didn't really touch on this, but there's an almost cartoonishness to the weather going around the world, destroying cities and killing people. And later on in the album, we will see there's this really odd tone that this album has all through it. But this is just genuinely a very affecting, sentimental little track, and I like it a lot. There follows a sort of dialogue bit. The lawyers get back to their thing. There's a bit where we find out that Blint's music can actually stop the weather somehow. He's implied to already know about this, as he's been implied previously in the album. Seems throughout the narrative to have some sort of weird foreknowledge about all of this that, like many things about the album, is never entirely explained. And it transitions into Office Chase, a really fun sort of semi-instrumental set piece about some sort of meteorological being pursuing one of Mr. Haig's secretaries through the office building. There's some great sound effects, you know, the typewriter or some sort of studio trickery approximating a typewriter is used really effectively. At one point towards the end of the song, there's a fun recurring bit about the secretary asking to be sent home early because her niece is on fire. It's interesting stuff, and it suits the narrative really well. There follows another roughly 4-minute piece of dialogue that has some very funny stuff in it that I honestly, I'm going to be honest with you guys, when I'm not listening to this album, I lose track of where the comedy bits in it are situated, and so I cannot tell you exactly what happens during this part, other than that there's a lot of bickering between Pepperman and Haig and Mr. Blint. There, maybe the part about Lulu's teeth is here. Anyway, at the end, Mr. Haig's goldfish Roland, who has been a sort of recurring background character, you know, Mr. Haig gives him a little bit of what he's having at some point. Blint offers to calm the goldfish, and then immediately after Blint leaves, the goldfish somehow leaves his bowl and commits suicide by jumping out of a window. And that leads us into Cool, Cool, Cool. Another extremely grim track, I think sung perhaps by the goldfish, but also perhaps just by killed by the freak weather around the world, as well as another posthumous character which we will be meeting relatively soon in the narrative of the album. In fact, on reflection, I think that's probably who the song is meant to be, sung from the perspective of the goldfish and Mr. Haig's wife Veronica, perhaps. I don't know. These are all guesses. It's a very interesting track. It's very hooky, but it also sort of defies the desire of the listener to function more like a regular pop song. You know, it kind of does the thing that, for me at least, most immediately jumps to mind as being sort of the gimmick of Take Me Out by Franz Ferdinand, of putting all of the verses at the beginning and all the choruses at the end. And it also has a certain, and this is one of a few things here where I have to directly give credit to the Consequences podcast, because I might have gotten to this point eventually on my own, but they pointed it out, and I think it's a very, very good point about this track, which is that at least the chorus here very much owes something to the track Sail On Sailor by the Beach Boys off of their 1973 album Holland, which I reviewed several years ago. Go check that review out. Go check out that album. It's one of my favorite Beach Boys albums. Phenomenal stuff. As is this song. Disc 3 of Consequences is very different than Disc 2. For one thing, the only side that actually has both dialogue and songs really only has one song and then a bunch of brief musical bits that serve the narrative much more heavily than anything else on the album. And then the final side of the album, side F, is entirely consumed by Blint's tune, a very interesting 20th century classical piece with Gizmotron. But anyway, I've killed enough time, and this video is going to go very long. So let's talk once more about the tracks. So after a brief interlude of a reprise of Cool, 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 Mr. Haig's wife Veronica smashes through the window, carried by a wave, as the active end of the world starts to impinge on the reality of the law offices. She's dead, and has apparently been swept in from the Canaries, where she was on a boat. And it's at this point that we get our first song. Sailor is a really cool, jazzy type track with a very melancholy air. It's very similar in some ways to Cool, 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 at least thematically. It's less explicitly about death, than Cool Cool Cool, but there is similarly a very dark overtone to it. You know, there's a slight bluesiness, but in the more understated or sort of 1920s jazzy variety of blues, as opposed to the sort of, you know, Clapton wailing on muddy waters definition of the term that has come to predominate in the post-war years. It's very, very good and has another very strong, soulful performance. Back in this play, things are really starting to go downhill. They have to block up the window to keep the water from coming in using filing cabinets and the corpse. You know, there may or may not be some Blint stuff. I honestly forget at this point. And then there's a bit where they turn the TV on and there's what may or may not be a spoof of either British Second World War films or American Civil War films. It could be either or. I would lean more towards World War II given the nationality of the people who made this album, but you know, it could be either or, about a dying soldier riding home from the front of the war against the weather, leading us into the next track. Mobilization is very similar to Office Chase in that it's less of a song and more of a musical interlude with some stage stuff. Basically, it represents the world's governments and militaries frantically mobilizing in an effort to keep the weather situation under control. There's some really cool musical elements. I really like the sort of British people making fun of Americans. There's a, you know, as somebody who watches a lot of classic Doctor Who, you know, you hear this from time to time. There's a very specific and very, very funny, the UK looking at America from across the pond version of the incredibly dodgy and terrible sort of mock English accent that Americans do sometimes. You see that in effect here. It's good stuff, although, once again, like I said, it's a part of the play, and I really can't imagine one listening to it without it. After that, Peppermint starts to talk about leaving, but then his car spontaneously explodes. There's some Blint stuff. The building starts to actively collapse around them, and then in a culminating act, the entire cast begs Mr. Blint to save the world in the next track.
I'll take you to the grave.
Please, Please, Please is interesting because it is a little bit more of a song than Mobilization, but again, you also can't really extricate it from the play. It's entirely sung by the four characters with the exception of some background Godley Creme vocals that come in from time to time, you know. I like the almost parodic 70s rocker track, you know, that backs it, but, you know, like I said about Mobilization, it is very much a part of the play. It performs its part admirably, but as such, I can't really evaluate it on its own. And maybe I shouldn't have tried. The building is collapsing. They all offer various things to Mr. Blint in order to get him to save the world. He agrees. They jump down the hole. There's an extended diatribe about how the Mr. Blint's tune is going to save the world that has something to do with pyramids and sand and Peppermint's nose poking out of a fishbowl. I do not understand it all, so I'm not even going to attempt to explain. It may or may not mean to you. And essentially everybody takes their part. You know, they have their roles to play. You know, somebody's going to turn the pages, somebody's going to count in, you know, somebody's going to be the audience, etc. And then finally we reach the end of side E, and the beginning of the count-in to 17 happens. That was something that I did not talk about, by the way. There's number 17s all over this album. I sort of alluded to it in the intro, which is why this video has a very specific deadline relative to all the other videos that I've made, and why I ultimately wound up cutting an entire review out of this series, and why this video in and of itself is perhaps not the best it could have been, although I do hope that it was in fact acceptable. But with that count-in of 17, we arrive at the last part of Consequences, Blint's tune. The entirety of side F is taken up by this 20-minute 20th century classical composition with Gizmotron, and I have in the past characterized this piece as just sort of kind of okay, and I both agree and I disagree with that. On the one hand, you know, it's nothing mind-blowing. You know, it has some really good themes. It sort of puts its arms around everything that's happened in the album so far, all the little instrumental bits and recurring motifs from the previous 5 sides of vinyl, and it very much sort of wraps it all up and throws in a heaping dollop of some sort of dashing romantic stuff, proper, almost Stravinsky-esque passages, very modern for the 70s, or maybe actually not, considering that Stravinsky died in the early 70s, but you know, anyway, we're leaving that in. Very interesting Gizmotron stuff, some very wonderful piano passages. It's just a very interesting, very compelling piece of music. It does sort of... I've always thought it fizzled out at the end a little bit, but, you know, perhaps somebody else would tell me that it was, in fact, the grandest finale that has been done in the classical tradition, or something approximating the classical tradition in the entire second half of the 20th century. But anyway, you know, the problem I have with this stuff is that, like, here's the thing. I do know 20th century classical music. It's probably the specific era of the Western orchestral tradition I know the best, but I still don't know it well enough to be able to talk about it with any kind of authority. And so I just kind of have to throw up my hands here and say that I like it, but it doesn't blow my mind, and I always go back and forth as to whether it's a fitting conclusion for the album. But in that sense, I guess it's the perfect conclusion for the album, because it just kind of leaves me speechless every time. I'm like, that's it? That's the end? I mean, sure, you've got the incredible grand composition, but what happens to these people? Did it work? Did any of it work? You know, did the weather stop? Like, there's no resolution to anything. And, you know, maybe we're not supposed to get one, because it is, after all, it is just satire. It is all just jokes. And sometimes kind of mean-spirited jokes at that, but at the same time, it's another piece of the puzzle. It's another enigma to consider about this record. And with that, we have reached the end of our Consequences video. Congratulations! You have just finished watching probably the first 45-minute review of Consequences on YouTube. If there are any others, I will be pleased but extremely surprised. There's nothing quite like this album, you know. It really is just such an incredible monument to what rock and pop were in the 70s, and just the sheer ridiculousness of two guys being given 6 sides of vinyl and this vast amount of studio money to make just this thing that, you know, flopped at the time and stands 45 years later as one of the supreme curiosities of the entire decade. And it's a funny album, because it's not one that I feel like I can really send people to. You know, it's an album that people should hear, but at the same time, it very much feels like this is something you need to listen to the first 4 10cc albums. You need to really let it marinate. You maybe even should listen to some of the Godley Creme albums from after this. And then, finally, when you have attained, you know, the true perfection of the... And when you have attained the true perfection, and you have, you know, internalized the lyrics to Sand in My Face, and you really understand their deeper meaning, then, and only then, with the assistance of your spiritual teacher, can you listen to Consequences. And I'm not really serious in that sense at all. I think you probably could listen to this and get something from it the first time, even if only that, you know, Peter Cook does a lot of funny voices, and, you know, and really latching onto the imagery of the goldfish committing suicide by jumping out of a window, which is what happened to my thumbnail artist. It's also the more obvious conclusion of, wow, the Gizmotron is really cool. There's one thing this album did, it's that it made me want a Gizmotron, and I don't even play guitar. Yeah, it's a good album, at least in sort of broad strokes. You know, I really don't know where I would put this in terms of the quality meter. I think it's like off in its own corner. It's not good or bad, it's just Consequences, you know. I've I commented to a friend of mine earlier today that it's either a 0 or a 10. There's no in between, but I don't know where I would put it because it's not a 0 for me, but it's not a 10 either. It's probably closer to the 10 than 0, but, you know, it's not really. It's just a very, very singular album that stands, like I said, as an absolute monument to how grandiose and ridiculous the 70s were at their height. And, you know, that's really all I have to say about it. I'm tired, and I'm sure you're tired, and the cat is very loudly playing with things underneath my chair as I'm recording this. So, all in all, you know, I've been your guide throughout the last 40 minutes or so of this incredible album, and I will see you all later on whatever thing I do next, now that I'm finally free from the obligations of the deadline of April 17th that I set out for myself. And yeah, bye.